In our world, we have this kind of desire to increase the duration and quality of life. As people, we don't want to die. God created us to want to live, and that is a good thing. But there is this kind of obsession in some ways where we are trying to live longer at a higher quality of life. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is this has been something that people have sought throughout all of history. We have things like the fountain of youth or the Holy Grail, that we are trying to find eternal life kind of on our own terms. We're trying to do it in a way that's about us, in a way that speaks to controlling our life situation and not allowing anything else to affect. Now, as followers of Jesus, we do recognize there are truths that Jesus has promised, and he tells us in John 14, verse 6, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus is the way to life. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 26, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Right? We are obsessed as a world of trying to avoid death. And even those who say they are ready, it's still a sense of uncertainty. Partially, it's not as though we can just kind of take a trip to the afterlife, see what it's like, make sure we're good, and then come back. Right? We have scriptures that tell us what heaven is going to be like, what that's going to be like. But until we've been able to physically go there, it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around that completely. So when we think things like Jesus and the resurrection, or in general, miracles from Scripture, we do have the question of how do we know this is true? Now, from a philosophical and a historical standpoint, there are different probabilities or reasons why you might confirm or deny something. And so as followers of Jesus, we claim that Jesus rose not by natural causes. We claim he died, and then he rose not because some medical expert was able to revive him, but because he was raised from the grave in a way that defeated death. That is what we believe. Now, the philosopher from 18th century, David Hume, he asked the question of which is less miraculous, that deceit is involved or that the dead man was raised. Now, that is an intriguing way to approach the resurrection of Jesus. Which is more plausible, that there was deceit or that Jesus actually rose from the grave? And as we progress into our Lent series, I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. But we do have to start with the premise of, what do you think about God? If you start with the premise that God does not exist, then you're going to say deceit is the most plausible explanation. Right? If God doesn't exist, then there had to be some type of deception happen to show that Jesus was alive or whatever that necessarily looked like. But if you're open to the idea that God exists, it opens up different possibilities. Well, maybe this resurrection of Jesus is legitimate. And then you can start looking at the historical facts differently. And there are a myriad of facts that philosophers, historians agree upon of this is a fact. Whether they believe, the people believe what they saw or not, it happened and people believe that. Now, the historian Michael Licona says if a historian holds that God does not exist, she will also hold that Jesus' resurrection is implausible. However, she holds that God exists, that he acts within human history, and that Christianity is probably true. She is most likely to hold that Jesus' resurrection is quite plausible. Why I bring that up is it's important to recognize our personal biases of what are our assumptions going into whatever it may be. Whether we're talking about something as significant as the resurrection of Jesus, or we're going into a meeting on our opinion of what are our biases going into it. Because we all make assumptions, we all have things that influence our thought process, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we recognize that, then it can give us a clearer picture of what we're actually thinking and the conclusions that we come to. Now, we're going to look at a couple miracles in the Old Testament today, and And as we progress in our Lent series, we're looking at different kind of resurrections, different times that someone was brought back to life in one way or another. So today we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 17, and we're looking at the story of Elijah. But before we get there, let me give you some context, and because we're going to start in verse 8. Elijah is the prophet in Israel. He's kind of the big wig. And there's this king in Israel named Ahab. Now, this is the time where we have the divided kingdom. When Israel was first formed, all 12 tribes formed one kingdom. Then after Saul and David and Solomon were kings, the kingdom split into two. And there was the northern kingdom, which retained the name Israel, which makes it a little confusing, and the southern kingdom, which had the name Judah, which is one of the tribes of Israel. And so we have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Ahab is part of the northern kingdom. He is part of the kingdom that split away from the rest of Israel. Now, the northern kingdom, most of their kings were just bad. They did things contrary to God. Now, the southern kingdom, they weren't necessarily all good kings, but they had kings that were trying to do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But Ahab was not just bad, he was the top bad dude, right? It tells us that he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than all the other kings before him. So he ruled for 38 years. So he had a long time to do really bad things. But not only that, he was married to Jezebel. Now, Jezebel is almost like an idiom in our world. It's because Jezebel was probably worse than Ahab. She did everything contrary to God. She wasn't just against God, or she destroyed the things that were for God. When I say God, I'm talking about Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, in contrast to the gods that she served. Likely Baal is one of the ones that we might be more familiar with. And so these two were just evil, and they did things contrary to Yahweh every step of the way. Well, Elijah is the prophet who is trying to give the word of the Lord to the people, and he prophesies earlier in 1 Kings chapter 17 that there's not going to be rain or dew for several years, and it's 3 years that it happens. So as you can imagine, Ahab and Elijah were not best friends. They did not get along. In fact, Elijah had to flee for his life. Now, God provided for him every step of the way, but as we pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 8, we find that God has told Elijah to go to the village of Zarephath near the city of Sidon. God said, I've instructed a widow to feed you there. So Elijah went to Zarephath, and when he got there, he found a widow gathering sticks. And he said to her, would you please bring me a little cup of water? And as she was going to get the cup of water, he said, would you also please get me a bite of bread too? And she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in my house. All I have is a handful of flour in the jar and a little bit of oil left in the bottom of the jug. I was gathering these sticks to make a last meal, and then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, do not be afraid. Go ahead and do what you had planned, but make a little bit of bread for me first. Then use what is left to make food for you and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and oil in your containers until the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her family continued to eat for many days. There was always enough flour and oil left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised. So this is problem number one that we find with the widow of Zarephath. And Elijah himself was in a bit of a predicament because he was living at the time. The first few verses of chapter 18 here or 17 is he is being fed by ravens. He is kind of running. He's made the prophecy about no rain or dew, and he is living by himself, and God is feeding him through ravens, bringing him bread and meat every morning and every night. That is how God was taking care of his physical needs. But God said it's time to move on, so he's going to Zarephath, going to this city in Sidon, and he promised provisions for Elijah. But one of the interesting components of God's command to Elijah is the fact that Zarephath, Sidon, are outside of the geographical area of Israel. So God is telling Elijah, leave the promised land. Leave the area that is your inheritance. Leave the area where I promised to bless the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I'm going to provide outside of the promised land. Now, there are other instances in Scripture where God does this, but it is interesting if it's a little bit different than normal, but it shows the spiritual health, or lack thereof, of God's people at that point. So Elijah meets the widow of Zarephath, and he asks for water and bread. Now remember, there was no rain. There's no rain or dew, according to the prophecy of Elijah. And it lasted for 3 years. So even something as simple as a cup of water, it's kind of a big deal. Now we live in a society with our infrastructure such as we can turn on the tap and water comes out every single time. And we can take that for granted, that we have access to clean water so easily. This was not necessarily the case where Elijah was. Water was scarce. There were no crops growing because there was no rain. It was just a really difficult situation. So to ask anyone for anything was really a big deal. But the woman, the widow of Zarephath, was pretty upfront. I don't have anything. She didn't even have a piece of bread in the house. But she does something that I think sometimes we miss. She states what she has. Got a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And why I think that's significant, so many times we can focus on what we don't have that we forget that we actually do have something. And when I say something, that doesn't mean you have a lot. But just because you don't have a lot doesn't mean you don't have anything to offer. And so the woman has something. This is what she has. Not that she was necessarily offering it, but she articulated what she had. Now, the widow of Zarephath stands in contrast to Jezebel. Jezebel was the Sidonian princess. The widow of Zarephath was right next to Sidon, was there, and she was living a humble life, a life that was struggling, a life that really was probably just trying to get by. Now, we don't know really anything about the spiritual decisions of this widow, but we do know that God is getting ready to use her for his purposes, which is in contrast to Jezebel, who is trying to stop God's purposes in every way. So the Sidonian princess that left Sidon and entered Israel is causing havoc in Israel, but God is going to use someone from Sidon for his purposes outside of Israel. And so we see irony happening here. Now, in part, we recognize the widow represents kind of the poorest of the poor. She was a widow, and all she had was a young child, young son that we'll find here soon. And so she really had nothing going for her. And in that culture, being a widow was put you in a very difficult economic situation. Not as though it's great now, but in that point, the widow didn't really have any way to earn income or provide for herself. She had to rely on somebody else to care for her. But she states what she has, even though she doesn't have much. But in that, she recognizes her low position, that she's going to eat and then die. This is kind of the last meal that she's planning for her and her son. But one of the underlying tensions that's happening here in these few chapters is we see the conflict between Yahweh and the pagan god Baal. Because Baal is the god of rain, of fertility, of crops. And we see that he is not showing up. And so these people like the widow of Zarephath see that Baal is not providing for them. And they're starting to question of, is Baal really legitimate? Now, the conflict with Yahweh and Baal and Ahab and Elijah culminates in the next chapter in 1 Kings chapter 18. I encourage you to read it. It's a really interesting story. But we see that there's a conflict happening here, and people like the widow of Zarephath are caught in this and trying to evaluate what they should be doing. But Elijah gives comfort and a promise. But he calls for the widow to display faith. Now, on some level, it's a little audacious that Elijah would say, hey, go make the food, but make some for me first. Take care of me first. Make the bread. You and your son are starving, but let me eat first. And so, some level, that's a little difficult to digest, but God does call us to step out in faith. Sometimes we have to live in faith before God provides. And there are different stories we see throughout Scripture where you had to step out before God started providing. But we live in a world that we want abundance without any sacrifice. We want to receive without actually having to give. But as I think about this story and what Elijah is challenging the widow of Zarephath to do, and the fact that we as people, we want to live. We want to increase our duration and quality of life. But when we come to following Jesus, we need to make sure that we live to obey. We don't obey to live. I don't obey Jesus just so it increases the odds of my success. If I do, then I'm not really obeying Jesus. I obey Jesus because of his love for me and my love for him. I live to obey. I don't obey to live. Now, from the widow's standpoint, as Elijah says, do it this way, and God is going to take care of you. On some level, she's probably like, what else do I got to do? Do I have any other hope at all? I mean, even if it would rain that day, it takes a while for the crops to produce anything to eat. She had one meal left. And as I think about her situation, I'm not saying that she only obeyed because she's like, what difference is it going to make? But I do think sometimes affluence can get in our way. If I can provide for myself, if I can take care of my own needs, if I can figure it out on my own strength, then I can take God out of the equation. Right. And it's real easy to do that. This widow had no other option. And so for her, it was, I might as well at least try. Nothing else has worked. And so I'm not saying that we need to live completely destitute lives, but we need to follow God with such reckless abandonment that it doesn't necessarily depend on us. It depends on him showing up. Because we recognize God has power in this world. He has power over creation. He can use creation for his own purposes. He can use the flower for his own purposes. He can use the oil for his own purposes. He can use the ravens to bring meat and bread to Elijah. He can use those things for his own purposes. He can use the Sidonian widow for his own purposes, even though she wasn't living in the promised land. He can use this world for his purposes. Now, we know the story. I didn't have any suspense in how I read the story today. God provided. Elijah's promise came true. The widow always had oil and flour. During the famine, she only had a handful to begin with, but God provided so that she always had food. Because God can multiply our resources. He can use what we have for his purposes, which is why I highlighted the fact that the widow stated what she had. If we can think about, God has given me this. This is what he has provided me with. This is what he has entrusted me with. And if that is what God has entrusted me with, then he is going to take care of me with his provisions. So we have to articulate what we have. And because you know what? God's math is different than our math. All right? Right? It is. That was a Dan Miller quote. I want to give credit to that one. But several people have mentioned that to me before. But the reality is God can provide regardless if we can figure out how he's going to provide. But the story doesn't stop there. Because as we continue in verse 17, sometime later, the woman's son became sick. He got worse and worse, and he finally died. Then she said to Elijah, "What have you done to me? Have you come here just to point out my sins and kill my son?" But Elijah said, "Give me your son." And he took the child from her arms, carried him up the stairs to the room where he was staying, and laid him on the bed. He cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, why have you brought tragedy to this woman who has opened her home to me, causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, please let this child's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the life of the child returned, and he was revived. Then Elijah brought him down from the upper room and said to his mother, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman told Elijah, "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the Lord truly speaks through you." So the son died, which is a huge problem. It's a huge tragedy regardless of the circumstances. But the woman was a widow, so her husband wasn't there anymore. So her economic prospects were limited at best. Her only hope was that her son would grow up to be able to provide for her, and now her son has died. It's tragic no matter the circumstances, but because of the limited opportunities for this woman, she really has no hope in the future. So she's distressed. And as you can imagine, she goes to Elijah and questions, "Why are you here?" Maybe we assume Elijah told her, "God said you were going to provide for me. God said he was going to have a widow from Zarephath, make it so I could eat food." And maybe he told her that, and now she's like, "Now what? What's God's plan?" I think a lot of times we can get into that same mentality. We think we're following God's plan, and all of a sudden we hit this roadblock, and we're like, "Now what? Why'd you bring me down this dead end?" So the widow goes to Elijah, not necessarily complains, but laments and grieves for her son. Now, in the ancient Near East, and this time, the prevailing thought was that bad things happen because of improper behavior. That there was some type of sin in the widow's life or the child's life that caused this tragedy to happen. And so, in her mind, if Elijah wouldn't have come, the sin would not have been highlighted, and she would not have been caught, and her son would still be alive. Now, Elijah has at least some level of compassion for the woman. Doesn't really talk about his emotion, but he saw the problem, and he said, "Well, let's cry out to the Lord for this." Now, we look at how God has provided for Elijah in this chapter. God has been able to provide for Elijah in a way that averted death. He provided food, water, sustenance for Elijah. Ravens brought bread and meat morning and night. The widow of Zarephath had oil and flour that didn't run out. So God provided ways for death to be averted, but now Elijah's taking it to another level. It's not just for God to avert death. Elijah prayed that God would revert it, that he would take it back, that he would bring this child back to life. Because he asks now for a greater miracle. And God heard. Now, that is a principle that we as followers of Jesus believe. We believe God hears our prayers. That doesn't mean he always answers them in the way we want. And a lot of times, we have this mentality that we view prayer as trying to convince God to do it the way we want, which is not the goal of prayer. Prayer is not convincing God my will is right. Prayer is about me getting aligned with God's will. But Elijah cried, but that doesn't mean we can't cry out to God. It doesn't mean we can't go to God and say, this is what I want you to do. We can do those things. But the point is not trying to convince God that you have the answer. But Elijah cried out to God, and he asked for a greater miracle than just averting death. But God heard the prayers, and the child was brought back to life. So this widow of Zarephath, this person who lived outside of the promised land, God provided 2 different miracles for her. Now, the first one benefited Elijah. And we recognize that. So there were some benefits for the purpose that God was going through to use Elijah as his prophet of giving him food. Now, it benefited the widow and her family as well. But the second one did not benefit Elijah at all. And it's just a story of God's goodness and blessings and God's miracles working in this world. But as Elijah is praying to God, he appeals to God for help. Now, Elijah is one of the kind of big spiritual people from the Old Testament. But we see how Elijah calls to God and said, would you do this? Bring this child's life back to him. But Elijah stands in contrast to Jesus in the sense of Jesus doesn't go to God and say, God, would you do this? Jesus commands this. In John chapter 11, he says, Lazarus, come out. Right? He commands the dead to raise, while we, as his followers, can appeal to God to do this work. So I want to make sure we recognize it's not as though Elijah had some extra special power. His power was dependent upon who God was and God using him. Now remember, God created us with a desire to live. But we have to decide, are we going to obey to live, or are we going to live to obey? Because there's a different mentality. And a lot of times we obey because we think it's going to be better for us in the end. But that's not the point. Now, I believe that the way God calls us to live is the best way. That sin is actually oppressive, but following God is actually the freeing life, that the best life that we can live. But that doesn't mean our worldly circumstances will always benefit us. Following Jesus is not always going to make my financial statement go up and to the right. That's not the point. That if following Jesus is about my financial statement going up and to the right, then I am obeying. I'm obeying to live, because I'm obeying Jesus to get things so that my situation would be improved. But Elijah shows us that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, actually has power and is in this world and is doing things. He can use creation for his purposes, but he also has control over it. So not only can he provide flour when there is none, he can provide life where there is none. You see, obedience is more important than survival. Survival isn't the goal. We are made with the desire to live, and that's good. I'm not saying we should desire short lives or anything morbid in that nature, but survival isn't the goal. If you get to the end of your life and say, well, I survived, nobody enjoys that. That's not the goal of where people are going. But we think of the widow Zarephath, and as I mentioned earlier, her spiritual health, her spiritual decisions aren't really ever mentioned. Did she actually follow Yahweh or not? Well, in verse 12, when Elijah asks her for bread, she says, I swear by the Lord your God. Not by the Lord my God, not by the Lord our God, by the Lord your God. Now, we might be getting a little nitpicky in this, but never once do we see a moment from the widow of Zarephath that she actually followed Yahweh, that she actually believed he was the one true God. Now, she saw his work. She saw how the flour and the oil never went out. But we never see that moment. And I'm not trying to judge her one way or the other, but to recognize that we can be beneficiaries of God's blessings in this world without actually following God. And why I mention that is we talk about, well, why do bad people sometimes get ahead? I can't necessarily answer that question. But we can look at instances in Scripture where God is not just blessing people who do this, and this. There's no formula to receive God's blessing from a worldly standpoint. And so we look at the widow of Zarephath and we see her situation on some levels is tragic. It was filled with God's blessings in the stories that we see. But you know what? She was going to get hungry again. You know, every time she went to go get flour and oil, she was hungry. But the promise was that she would always have flour and oil until God brought rain and the crops grew again. Now, we look at the New Testament, and we see in John chapter 6, Jesus says, I am the bread, that he is our sustenance. In John chapter 4, he says, I will give you water so that you will never thirst again. Jesus can give us the sustenance we need so that our worldly needs pale in comparison. Because we're always going to get hungry again. We're always going to need more of something. See, our worldly needs will never be fully satisfied. But Jesus can satisfy them. Another thing is, the boy would die again. He's not alive today. Maybe he lived a long life. Maybe he lived a life that was really, really long and really, really prosperous. Maybe he didn't. But we know he died again. And so God can give us these worldly blessings. He can provide food for us. He can provide ways for us to avert death. He can even reverse death, but eventually we're going to die again. We're going to get hungry again. The reason I mention that this morning is we think about the widow's situation, how tragic it is. You're always going to have more needs. You're always going to have more problems. You're always going to have more frustrations. You're always going to have more annoyances in your life. The life that God calls us to live is not a way that we can just figure out how to solve those problems. He will help us solve them. I believe He will. But the life He calls us to live is a life of obedience, not so that our life can be better, but so that we can be living in Him. Amen. It's not about our circumstances. So I don't know where you are today. Maybe you're in a really good, positive place. You're like, this is kind of a Debbie Downer sermon today. But maybe you're like, man, I got things in my life that just aren't right. I've got problems that I don't know how to solve. And you know what? I'm not going to give you the answer of how you can solve those problems. I can't answer all the problems in the world or why this happens or why that doesn't happen. All I can challenge you today is cling to the goodness of God. Because you know what? The people you know are going to fail you. I'm going to fail you. Your finances can fail you. You're going to have disappointments, frustrations all over the place. So many people leave the church because they were hurt by the church, not because they were hurt by Jesus. And so the goodness of God is where we can reside. I don't know how He'll provide. I don't know what it's going to look like. But my challenge to you is to make sure that you live to obey, don't obey to live.